Okay, it's 7 o'clock. We'll open this meeting of the Kenmore Planning Commission. The first item of business is citizen comments. We have a list here, I believe. Okay, our first speaker is Ann Agard. So, yeah, please state again when you come up. Please state your name for the record and your address. Although we have it, just for the record, please, Ann. Thank you.
My name is Ann Agard, and I am a citizen in Bothell. And I am here tonight because of my participation in many planning activities that involve the Sammamish River and Lake Washington, as well as Puget Sound. So Kenmore plays a very critical role in the recovery of Chinook salmon and thereby the orca, the killer whales. And because of their extensive numbers of wetlands, streams that empty into Lake Washington, as well as the Sammamish River. As you are probably aware, the stream temperatures in the Sammamish are already at heights that are lethal to salmon. And because of climate change, these temperatures will increase, as will the wetlands dry up. So we have a big problem ahead of us. And it's important that these critical area regulations are protective to the no net loss standard and that they follow the guidelines that are drafted currently to meet all the requirements. So I've addressed three of the issues that I think are critical in these wetland regulations, particularly for the critical areas ordinance. One is that there is a redefinition of no net loss, and I spell out some suggestions on how to redefine it. Secondly, this exception to the public agency and utilities, the Kenmore Municipal Code 1855-150, and I strongly oppose the revised definition of the exception, which grants exemptions from the critical area ordinance requirements to a public agency or public utility for a recreational facility, a park, or a detention facility. So I spell out why this is true. In particular, there are the Department of Ecology guidelines, which are not guidelines, but requirements for Shoreline Master Program adoption, which includes the Critical Areas Ordinance, which you're looking at now, requires that you address the no net loss standard of exempt development so that there is no low net loss in the aggregate from exemptions, the ecological functions from the exemptions that are granted. And I do not believe that the risk that is possible for this exception has been addressed either in the Shannon and Wilson report or in any of your other documents. Finally, I support this Department of Ecology's concern with your buffer enhancement strategy, and for similar reasons that, and I quote particularly the shoreline guidelines, WAC 173-26-221, which again is a requirement that you have conservation of vegetation as necessary to ensure no loss of shoreline ecological functions and ecosystem-wide processes. And the recent letter from the Department of Ecology, which I reviewed, which was on the table when I came in, make it clear even more about why they are opposing this provision in your proposed critical areas ordinance. Do you have any questions for me?
I live at 16305 90th Avenue Northeast in Kenmore, up near Inglemoor High School. And I've never done this before, so I'm new at it. I'm not even sure, but I have wetlands on my property. Or so it was told to me when I bought the property. I have had various engineers out there. All of the water that is on my property is runoff from other property and or city streets, according to multiple engineers. And this increase of buffer is going to significantly deplete the value of my property and the buildable area of my property. And there are 3 other lots just in my neighborhood alone that currently are unbuildable because of these, what the engineers and I call the supposed wetlands. I completely endorse Ann for bringing up about the exception about public works being exempt from these situations. I think that the public works project should have the same conditions put on them as any public owners of property or, you know, regular owners of property. However, I think that her point in that the wetlands are drying up is that I know somebody in my neighborhood that has lived in the neighborhood for almost 30 years, that the wetlands on my property used to have a lot more water on them. There is now no running water on my wetlands, my supposed wetlands. You know, the stream is barely a divot in the ground that's barely 3 inches deep, and the ground is moist, but again, the engineers have said it basically, at this point in time, would not be considered wetlands. So to increase these buffers on individual landowners, residential landowners, is, I think, needs to be reconsidered and or on a case-by-case basis with a determination of the engineers and the city development council, development department, rather than just this blanket situation. Does that make sense?
Good evening, John Hendrickson, Kenmore, Washington. I spoke to you at the last meeting and about the PAW and also my concern about the shoreline at Log Boom Park. And after I was done, the staff person, Teresa, I think is her name, told you that the PAW had absolutely nothing to do with the shorelines. You know, and so when I looked into your work papers from that meeting on page 4 on attachment 9, under the shoreline section, shoreline master plan, it said, the following sections of the Kenmore Municipal Code are adopted and incorporated by reference as part of the Shoreline Master Program. And the fourth one down cites the Code Section 1855-160 exception for public agency utility exceptions. So, you know, the staff person kind of was very forceful, a little bit like the Wizard of Oz when he said, ignore that man behind the curtain, and that this has nothing to do with the shoreline. All I know is when I was on the council in 2008, 2009, when our attorney finally, when we were confronted with a legal opinion that we couldn't use the PAW to do the log boom park, which they want to take the vegetation out, and you know, it'd be nice to have a view down there, but the vegetation is needed for the salmon, the young salmon, to have protection going down out to the sound. So you need to protect it, and we were told that since we were trying to use the PAW illegally, and we couldn't do it, then that project had to be stopped. And I don't know if we didn't have the shore. I thought we had shoreline master plan back at that date. So how come? So it really raises the issue of due diligence that you folks need to do on your own. You can't rely on I think the city has demonstrated that they're going to give you all the information that you need to make an informed decision. Due diligence is your responsibility. Ask the questions or get the information from somewhere else if you're not getting it. So you need to know that history. You should be looking at what's going on with Department of Commerce, Department of Ecology, and you know they're struggling with the city right now with this PAW, and they're kind of going back and forth. But the real question is, should the city be above the law? Should you try to be making a law that's in conflict with state law? Now, the city has a long history of wanting to do this, and if you're just going along with it, you're part of the problem instead of part of the solution. Another example I just referenced for you is that when we first incorporated, we were not informed about the plan for building this city hall, how much it would cost, how many people we could afford to hire. And we requested information on how big a city hall can we afford to build. They wouldn't respond to us over a period of 2 years. And then in the last minute, they pulled out their city hall plan that was part of the original comp plan as an appendix, never told us about it, and that's what we ended up using. Build a city hall for 40 people when we were told we could only afford 16. So you have to do due diligence yourself to make an informed decision. Please do that.
Thank you, John. Come on up and state your name and address. That would be fine.
My name is Phyllis Finley. My address is 5962 Northeast Arrowhead Drive in Kenmore. I just have 3 points. The first is I'm asking you, pleading with you to please give yourselves time to study public comments, not just tonight, but my first Planning Commission meeting was the last one that you had, and I noticed that there were public comments followed immediately by action on your part. On the minutes tonight, I'm noticing that public comments are on the agenda number 2, followed mere minutes by your action on agenda item number 4. It gives the illusion that you're not really considering what the public comments are. And I want to assure you that, at least from my point of view, we're not commenting just to be commenting, but we really want you to have information that you might not get from city staff or elsewhere. Point number 2 on the PAW. Please don't give the city at any time exemptions or exceptions that you don't give city citizens. Please keep in mind the goal. If the goal is to protect the environment, then we all need to pursue that goal, not just private citizens, but the city as well. And finally, number 3, again, please continue to do due diligence, to listen to public comments, to give yourselves time to follow through on those, ask questions, study them, and not act as a rubber stamp for information that you're given elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next agenda item is the approval of minutes. We have 2 meeting minutes to cover, so would entertain a motion for the March 15th minutes from my colleagues. March 5th is,
Okay, I thought you
Yeah.
said 15.
I misspoke then. March 5th. Someone care to make a motion? Second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Abstain.
Abstain. Okay, those minutes pass. Similar, entertain a motion for the March 26th meeting minutes.
I move approval.
Second?
1, 2. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Abstain.
Abstain. Thank you. Okay, both sets of meeting minutes are so approved. Okay, our next agenda item is the final recommendations on critical areas and shoreline master program amendments, and invite up the city staff and their and the consultants as well. Before you get started, I would like to give you guys the opportunity to respond to any of the public comments that were made earlier tonight. So, at your
Yep, I think that was our plan.
Okay.
While the public comments were ongoing, I think Laurie and Amy were taking good notes so they can provide a response this
Great.
evening before we get into the other items on your agenda.
Right. So, good evening. I thought I would start with the letter from Ms. Agard. And she had 3 points that were raised. One was the definition of no net loss. That actually is in the shoreline regulations that you looked at last time. And the no net loss regulation or definition came actually from the WAC, the Washington Administrative Code. The state code was based on that. So I think staff would recommend against revising that, considering that we used the state guidance for that. The second question had to do with the public agency and utility exception. I think there continues to be an ongoing question about what exactly this is. The public agency and utility exception falls into the same category as variances and reasonable use exceptions. Those 3 processes are used to look at circumstances when some impact may be unavoidable. And variance and reasonable use exception are typically designed for private applicants. As we went through this process with the public agency or utility exception, it certainly is not an exception to the rules. They have to go through a very similar, in fact, a more rigorous process than a private applicant would have to do. And in discussions with Commerce, you remember we held a focus group last fall with the agencies. The conclusion was that this type of an exception, which is in the Ecology Model Ordinance, could be used not only for linear facilities like utilities and streets, but could also be used for expansions of existing facilities. That's the difference. And although the city initially had recommended that it be used for new facilities, after discussion with the agencies, it was decided that in fact the variance or reasonable use process would be used for new facilities, and the criteria in those 2 sections, the variance and reasonable use criteria, were amended so that could be used more appropriately to address public agencies. So those were the series of changes that were made. We also included new zoning code flexibility to allow projects to consider reducing, for example, street setbacks, or in some cases parking, to allow the project to be moved as far as possible from the feature. And if you would like to go over the criteria a little bit later, that would be fine. In the comment, I'll just jump to the comment by Mr. Hendrickson about using the PAUE in the shoreline. That is an exception, and it cannot be used in the shoreline. And in the materials that you reviewed last week, the section that he read from reads, the following sections of the Kenmore Municipal Code are adopted and incorporated by reference as part of the Shoreline Master Program. And it says Chapter 1855, which is the critical area rules, except for, and that is where 1855 160 falls, the public agency and utility exception. So he read the introductory comment but did not read the following comment, which says it cannot be used in the shoreline. So I wanted to clarify that. And then the third point of Ms. Agard's memo had to do with the the buffer width reduction with enhancement. And in fact, the amendments that we'll go over tonight, the recommended new amendments as a result of the ecology letter, do eliminate that provision. So the second speaker was concerned about the new buffer widths. And as you know, we've been negotiating with ecology about those. And the last word from them today was that they would like us to use their standard buffer widths. So again, our recommendation is that we follow their buffer widths. And that there was also a concern that the PAUE should have the same rules as those for a private applicant. As I mentioned, the PAUE criteria are in many ways stricter than for a private applicant. And again, I'm happy to actually go to that code section later in the meeting if you'd like, and we can read right through all of the criteria for that. And then I think those were the main comments that I wanted to respond to.
Okay, thank you, Lori. I wanted to bring up something. I think you addressed this last time in some of the earlier comments and communications about how this might apply to St. Edward's ball field.
Correct.
And I believe also log boom was raised, and essentially the point, if I understood it, was that this is sort of a potential end run around environmental protections, and according to these comments. So I think you addressed that at the last meeting, but could you
Sure.
reiterate?
Yeah, so
those points?
again, Log Boom Park is in the shoreline, as is Squires Landing, as are all the facilities along Swamp Creek. You cannot use the PAUE in the shoreline jurisdiction. So we're not trying to hide anything here. It states very clearly, and ecology has been very firm with us, that it cannot be used in the shoreline jurisdiction. As far as the criteria, the ball fields, as I stated last time, have a permit in for a variance, for a buffer variance, and that would be an expansion of an existing facility, but it is not, the project is already in the permitting process. So
it's effectively grandfathered under the current.
Grandfathering is not quite the right word, but
There's already kind of an application in process. So it's not really grandfathered, it's that you continue to review the application that's in process. So you don't have to apply for a new permit because there are new rules. So we are in the variance process, which is an allowed process currently, and it would still be an allowed process to apply for a variance for modifying a buffer.
correct. I think in terms that this might, if you're ready, it might be a good time to turn to the PAUE criteria, so we can walk through what exactly the PAUE
Yeah, could you,
is,
could you
if the commission wishes to do so.
Yeah.
Yes, so it's attachment 1 to your packet. Unfortunately, the pages after the first page all have attachment 2 on them. So if you start at the beginning where it's labeled attachment 1 and go to page 11.
I'm sorry, so attachment 1, page, what's labeled attachment 1, page 11?
Actually, it's 13. It's page 13. It's labeled in the upper right-hand corner, it says attachment 2, page 13, but it's... Yeah, why don't, yeah, if, could we have...
Suzanne, could you,
We'll call it up on the screen
okay, thank you.
so the audience can see it as well.
So this one, is that right? Okay, thank you.
Okay, so this is in the section where variance and reasonable use are described. It's the same process. You'll remember that we had a series of flow charts that were in the background paper that showed that it's the exact same process. It goes through what's called a Type 2 permit as the variance and reasonable use. So there is a public process. And the review criteria, the first one is that there is no, there is no feasible location for the, for the proposed, no other feasible location for the proposed development with less adverse impact on the critical area buffer. Then that there is no other practical alternatives, and that's described. It would have to unreasonably restrict the ability to provide public agency or utility services to the public. Again, what we're talking about here are parks, schools, it could be a fire facility, it's any public agency facility. And so the fourth is that it does not propose an unreasonable threat. It protects and mitigates impacts to the critical area functions and values consistent with best available science. It achieves no net loss of critical area functions and values. You have to demonstrate mitigation sequencing in the report, along with the demonstration of how mitigation will be provided using a watershed approach. The development activities involve the least intrusion into and disruption of the critical area necessary while fulfilling a public purpose and need. And again, if you think back to the PAUE report, there was a description that public agencies have other duties to fulfill. They have to provide spaces for education for students. They have to provide roads, streets, utilities. I mean, there are obligations that must be satisfied. The proposal has to be consistent with a utility system plan, capital facilities plan, master plan, program, or policy that has been the subject of a public review process, and consistent with the general purpose and intent of the comp plan and regulations. And then there are specific approval conditions provided, that you have to conform to the critical area report, and you have to look at appropriate best management practices, and there are other sources of guidance for that. If we look at the next item down, that's for variances. And if we look at the variance criteria, it's currently special circumstances for a private development proposal. There are special circumstances that doesn't quite fit with public agencies. So again, this is where we added in some more information. And similarly, the reasonable use exception was amended to address new facilities. Okay, so the PAUE can only be used for expansion of existing facilities, and the other processes would be used for new facilities.
Any questions? Lori, I did have one other question about
Sure.
a note that came in, or I think it was one of the comments last time, and it has to do with somehow the proposal would narrow the exemption for pervious trails. There was a comment to that effect, and the letter I have that was put in, Tom Fitzpatrick.
Oh, correct. Right.
Also has some, I guess, some proposed changes in his view for trails and their design, and I was wondering if you could
Right.
take a look
So,
at those specific points.
Right, sure. So the amendments that are being recommended in that, I think it was an email, staff does not support. And the reason for that is that the trails that are under discussion in Mr. Fitzpatrick's email have to do with public or other pedestrian trails. And the changes that he is recommending would allow other types of trails, and primarily mountain biking trails, which historically we have been advised by our scientific support are not a good thing in the shoreline. They cause erosion, remove vegetation, it changes the water runoff through the ruts, et cetera. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Amy, but we did not support his change, which would allow that type of use.
Yeah, I think you captured it. I think our idea for these trails in shoreline jurisdiction is that they be for much more passive uses that are not going to be altering the soil and the runoff and other sorts of processes that could degrade conditions downstream or downslope of those trails.
Do you have any idea how many, I don't know, miles of trails this would affect?
Well, it would affect the trails that are just within the shoreline jurisdiction. And so within 200 feet of, I think this was directed toward the lake. It was a concern about, historically, Mr. Fitzpatrick has commented about trails in St. Edward State Park. And so within the 200-foot shoreline jurisdiction, that is where the prohibition would be. There are many miles of trails in the park. I don't know how many there are.
That are currently open to bikes?
I don't know if there are rules about
See
that, but
I used to see a lot of bikes in St. Ed's. I mean, is
yeah.
it? Yeah, it's not allowed on all trails, right, right. Parts of, yeah. Yeah, right, right.
To clarify, what you're responding to is the request he was making through his comment is something that would not be allowed because the shoreline
In the shoreline.
setback would not allow it.
Well, it's the shoreline jurisdiction, actually. It
And-
doesn't really have to do with a setback. It has to do with the area where the
Okay.
shoreline rules apply. And so it would be trails in that area. So on the slope down to the lake,
So
if we're
only-
thinking of St.
so
Edwards.
they can't. So basically, you're saying that those kinds of trails do not allow bikes because of all those different reasons.
As proposed, right,
Okay.
right.
So from the staff's point of view and from our consultant's point of view, to stay consistent with our protection of the environment, we wouldn't include that. We wouldn't consider
Correct.
that, actually.
Right. Mr. Fitzpatrick asked that the word trails should be designed for pedestrian access be changed to trails should be designed only for non-motorized access.
I see, okay. Okay.
It does clarify that wheelchairs, as written by the staff, would be allowed, correct, or no?
So wheelchair access is an ADA issue, and I think previously we've talked about the section in the shoreline rules that addresses exceptions when needed to achieve ADA requirements.
Okay, so that would be, an allowed use, essentially, right?
If it's, yeah. Depending, I mean, I don't know that ADA applies to every thing. If you were accessing public building or a restroom or something like that, I think it certainly would apply, but.
Okay. Any comments on that point or any of the others that staff has brought up? Okay.
So should I move forward?
Please do.
Okay. All right, so the goal of tonight's agenda is to accomplish 3 tasks for this agenda item. First is to finalize your recommendations on the flood hazard area regulations, including there were 2 revised definitions and then a revised illustration that you had requested. So those have now been reviewed both by FEMA and Ecology. FEMA has looked at them several times. So I think we're feeling pretty confident that those are appropriate. The second thing is to finalize the recommendations on the wetland regulations. And again, this is late breaking news. We got the letter this afternoon. And so I had emailed it. You may have had a chance to see it, but if not, we're happy to go over those documents this evening. And then the third thing is to determine, if you can finish your recommendation tonight, whether or not you would be available for a May 13th joint meeting with the City Council to present your recommendations. We're on kind of a tight time frame here just because June 30 is our deadline. So what I was going to do next is sort of talk about the wetland information, since that's new information, if that would be helpful. So as you know, Ecology contacted us on March 5th suggesting some changes to the amendments. And we previously provided some amendments. Those are in attachment 3 to your packet. You saw those last time. But those comments addressed most of their concerns. But there were 2 outstanding issues: wetland buffer widths, and I've already given you a preview of the degraded buffer reduction with enhancement. So we provided a memo to Ecology to address those issues, and they reviewed that, and that was attachment 4 in your packet. And then today, we received the letter, and that's in front of you from Ecology, that suggested that we use the wetland buffer table attached to the letter. So the second document in front of you are the recommended changes, and you'll see that we have amended those wetland buffer recommendations to match the attachment in the letter. So Category 1 wetlands, the buffer would change from a flat 150 feet to a range between 75 feet and 225 feet, depending on the habitat score. Now, our consultant has done quite a bit of background work, and information was in the letter to Ecology to show that the city, as far as we know, does not have a Category 1 wetland. Even our most valuable wetlands are Category 2 wetlands. So I just point that out.
But Ecology seemed to think otherwise.
So
Can you explain? Yeah.
Yeah, so Ecology, and I should have Amy, for years, we have been confident in saying there were no Category 1 wetlands in the city. Then when a new application came in for some work at Log Boom Park, a consultant did an evaluation that concluded that it was, in fact, a Category 1 wetland. So do you want to describe what happened? Next, we were like, what?
Yeah, so when we had our initial discussion with Department of Ecology, and we're explaining and describing existing conditions in the city as we understood them, and said that it was our understanding based on prior consultant work and other knowledge of the city that there were no Category 1s, and they said, oh yes there is, there's Log Boom Park. And we were very surprised. So we got a hold of the Log Boom Park wetland rating that had been completed for that park project, and it did say Category 1, and inquired back to the consultant who prepared it, and a different biologist reviewed it and found a couple of errors. And so correcting those errors brought it back down just to a Category 2 wetland. And so they documented that in a memo and provided the updated rating form with those corrections, and we provided that to Department of Ecology. So that was the only Category 1 wetland, and it was only Category 1 for a short time.
Okay, so you're all square with ecology on that?
Right, yeah.
Okay.
The particular issue is that one of the issues was that Lake Washington, considering the amount of seaplane and boat use and other, is considered a high-intensity use. And in the original rating form, it was not considered high-intensity. It was considered, I think, moderate or low. And that makes a very big difference in the rating in terms of, particularly for habitat score and landscape potential. So that was what made the difference.
Okay.
Thanks.
So for the Category 2 wetlands, the proposed new buffers would range from 75 feet to 225 feet as well. So there would be a buffer reduction from 100 feet to 75 feet for the lower habitat value wetlands, an increase from 150 to 225 for the higher habitat value wetlands. A similar circumstance occurs for the Category 3 wetlands. That range would go from 60 feet to 225 feet. A reduction from 100 feet to 60 feet for the lowest habitat scores, a 10-foot increase for habitat scores of 6 to 7, and a significant increase from 100 feet to 225 feet for the highest habitat scores. For Category 4 wetlands, the buffer would remain unchanged. In order to use these buffer standards, we also added in some impact minimization criteria, a chart, and also a requirement for a habitat corridor, if feasible, for those higher habitat. It's 6 points or more wetlands. So as for the buffer reduction with enhancement, as I mentioned earlier, Ecology continues to recommend that that option be eliminated. And as you'll see, it's all crossed out in the materials you have in front of you.
I would just add, too, that the 8 to 9 habitat points wetlands, which have the 225-foot buffer recommendation, we looked also at where, if there are wetlands in the city that could have 8 or 9 habitat points, and we were able to generate a hypothetical wetland only that is placed in just the right sweet spot within the Bastyr St. Edward State Park area that would enable it to have a 1 kilometer greater than 50% of a 1 kilometer surrounding area that is not a high intensity use. So it's going to be extremely rare that you would have any wetlands that would fall into the largest buffer requirement.
Sure, go ahead, ask a quick question.
I was just wondering about the required measures to minimize it. Toxic runoff or stormwater runoff is coming across your property. How do you minimize that? Coming from other people's property or city streets, how do you minimize that? Because I mean, I'd like to maintain my wetlands and keep them as natural as possible, which I've done for over 5 years. But considering that that's all the water coming onto my property, I just don't how I'm supposed to comply with the requirements.
Right, so the minimization measures only apply if you're doing a development proposal or a new activity on the property adjacent to the wetland area. So for example, in the case where there was a property that was impacted by toxic runoff and someone came in to propose a new development on that property, that would be the time maybe they would have to install some kind of a treatment measure. I don't know what it would look like, but it's not that people who are already living on a property would suddenly have to take on this new burden. It's related to development proposals.
Thanks, Lori. So again, the buffer reduction with enhancement is gone
Right.
under
right.
the proposal.
We felt that that was an unfortunate choice on Ecology's part because we believe it's an incentive to have a small amount of reduction if in fact you're going to be improving the quality of the buffer. But understand.
Okay.
So those were really my remarks, and unless you have more questions, then again, the actions were to talk about the flood hazard area regulations, talk more about wetlands and make a decision there if you're ready, and then we'll talk about the meeting on May 13th if you come to conclusion tonight.
Anybody got questions about the?
I don't.
I had just a couple things I wanted to at least ask about. There was one. There was some information about a lot of invasive species within certain buffers in some of the material there. Is there any requirement to address invasive species within a buffer, or is that no one has really any sort of responsibility or obligation to do anything about that if it's within a...
Well, it could come up under a buffer averaging scenario. Again, if development were proposed, and that if someone is proposing to average their buffers, then they have to enhance the buffer, which would remove presumably invasive species. There are general rules about certain species. I think you're probably talking about blackberries,
Yes,
but there are other noxious weeds that I think there are state rules about removal that you are obligated. I'm trying to think what some of those are. Purple loosestrife, maybe, where you do have an obligation to remove them. And then otherwise, I believe that removal of invasive species is, you don't have to get a critical areas permit. I think that is actually an exemption from the rules, if that's.
Okay.
So.
Okay, thank you. So unless there's any other comments, I think we're ready to move on.
I think we're all, I think
We're all
the
confused.
staff is kind of saying, is the planning commission had their questions answered? And do you have enough information to make a motion on recommending approval of the recommendation on the floodplain regulations, and then making a motion on the wetland regulations, if you feel you are ready and have enough information and have had all your questions answered?
Any more discussion?
I'd be happy
any
to make a
questions?
motion here. I just want to be sure. We tabled two issues our last meeting. I think we referenced them in the motion at our last meeting. Could you just remind us of what those were? What's still on the table that we need to make a recommendation on?
Right, it's the flood hazard area regulations, which are attachment 2 in your packet. And then it is the wetland regulations, which it's general introductory information. It includes the PAUE and the wetland regulations, which is attachment 1 to your packet. The flood hazard rules have 2 corollary items: the change to the definitions and the illustration of the floodway and flood hazard area. And the wetland regulations have 2 corollary attachments. One is attachment 3 to your memo, which is some of the changes that we were responding to Ecology about that were in your last packet. And then these new changes tonight.
separate these into two motions? Or?
I believe that would be the
That would be the-
appropriate way to proceed.
I move that the planning commission approve the recommendations, staff's recommendations related to the floodplain as explained and revised in attachment 2.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Any discussion on that motion? All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Passes unanimously.
I recommend that the planning commission recommend to the city council acceptance of staff's final recommendations related to wetlands as explained in attachments A1, or 1 and 3 in the most current version.
And did you want to include also the changes from this evening?
Yes, I'm sorry, my language is intended to accept in its entirety recommendations.
Okay.
I'll second it.
Any discussion on that motion? All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Passes unanimously.
Well, that's a big project and many hours of work. So the last thing related to,
Thank you, because most of that work is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for all your,
Thanks for helping us.
and, yeah, and Amy as well, and your colleagues, yeah.
so the last item related to this agenda topic is whether or not we would have a quorum for a May 13th joint meeting, at which time you could present your recommendations to the city council. You have one intervening meeting on, I should never say what these dates are. Really, it's just a bad idea. May 7th is your next meeting, and at that point, we could talk about the presentation if you are available for this May 13th joint meeting, which is a Monday, correct?
On the 13th?
For both.
Yep, I'm here for both.
Okay.
That is Mother's Day, right?
They-
Oh, okay. I'm safe either way, but throw that out there. Some of us may find it.
Okay. So we will have a quorum in
Right.
any case, okay. and I-
Okay, so we will go ahead and schedule that meeting, and
Okay.
then at your first meeting in May, talk about how you wish to do the presentation.
Can you make sure that Commissioners Mulcair and Olson
Yes.
also are in the loop on those? And just, Lori, what do you envision as this presentation? I mean, obviously, you guys have done the vast majority of the work. What's your
Right.
general approach to this particular
So,
presentation?
Again, it's a wealth of information. So I guess what I'm envisioning is we did a short summary of all of the amendments. So I would anticipate that being the first attachment, then, of course, with all of the recommendations. And then I thought it might be useful to have kind of an FAQ memo that talked about some of the more controversial issues. The PAUE, the heron buffer has come up several times. Anyway, there were 6 or 7 things that I thought, limitation on development in high landslide hazard areas, things like that I thought might be useful to go into a little more depth with the council. And then I can give, if you choose, think about whether you want me to give an introductory presentation and then you all can speak to different points, or however you want to do it. Maybe you would prefer to give the presentation. It's your choice.
Well, I think we can certainly talk about that more at our next meeting, but I think it would be helpful, yeah, if we at least offered some general comments about maybe some of the highlighted issues that and they might overlap with what's in your FAQ
Sure.
memo, but I think we would want to highlight, just in my opinion, a handful of the key issues that we worked on in this process, so. Or at least to flag them for their attention. I
Right.
presume they may have questions, and
Right.
so, okay. Does that sound reasonable for everyone? Okay. We'll do more details at the next meeting.
Yeah,
but, okay.
sure. Okay.
Sound good?
Well, I'm sorry. Did we ever approve the May 13th joint meeting? I know that they said that the staff asked us to discuss that, but do we need to approve it, or is that
I think we were just asking for your availability for
just
that
asking
joint
for
meeting.
availability?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I should add one last thing, which is the city council packets go out a couple of weeks ahead of time before the meeting, or a week and a half, something like that. So actually, the packet will go out at the end of it'll go into the review process at the end of next week. So if you feel that the summary and the FAQs and then all of your amendments are adequate, you can use that as the basis. And if you have something else that comes to mind, I probably should know about that this evening.
Okay,
Okay?
sounds good.
All right.
So if you're ready, we'd like to kind of shift gears to the next topic. So now we're going to, I'd like to introduce Maureen Kalaisi, who's our Parks Project Manager, and so she's going to be working on the update to the Park Recreation and Open Space Plan. So we're going to shorten that and call it the PROS Plan, but that's what is meant. There was a memo in your packet which gave some information on what the PROS Plan is, what's including in it, and also a schedule. But we do have a short presentation this evening. Are the screens working? If you raise your screen, then you can kind of see it on the screen, and the audience then can look at it on the big screen. So while you're doing that, like I say, this is going to be a process that takes several months. So this is just the start, the introduction. I believe some of you have already kind of gone through an update of the PROS plan when we did this in 2013. So this is one of those things that cycles around every 6 years. So for those of you who don't know a lot about it, then Maureen's now going to kind of step through the presentation, and then after the presentation, we're here to answer any questions.
Thank you. The PROS Plan is a document that really helps guide parks decisions, how we improve our park system through capital improvements and through recreation programming. It is, let me advance the slide here. It's consistent with the comprehensive plan elements. The natural environment element as an example of that, where it's an appendices of the PROS plan, the capital facilities plan, and the city's capital improvement plan, which is usually a capture of 6 years of capital improvement projects for parks. We also were required by the state Recreation and Conservation Office to update this plan every 5/6 years, by the end of 6 years. So that's why we're here this year, is because it's due to be updated by the end, March of 2020 is the last drop dead that we can submit the plan for being able to qualify us for state and federal grants. It includes what our existing asset inventory is. That's including our physical assets as well as our natural assets. It documents the goals and policies associated with parks and recreation facilities and recreation programming, so that we have an overarching guiding policy level guidance to help us decide on what is important and how to prioritize our capital improvements. It documents the public process involved in updating the plan from each update from 2013 to 2019. It includes estimates of our park and recreation demand and need, evaluates facility and service needs, including recreation programming as well as park facilities. It also helps, it identifies financing options and partnership opportunities. And out of all of that, we then can develop a 20-year capital facilities plan, 20-plus year. It's really the unconstrained list of capital improvements or projects that helps guide us. And each 6 years, we're sitting here trying to update that so that that large overarching set of projects is consistent. So we're looking at that and seeing what did we say in 2013 and what conditions or what is the public's needs and how would that list either maintain and stay the same or change based on need and demand analysis. And then we develop a ranked list of projects, ones that we know that we can fund and we can implement within 6 years. And just as we kind of talk about the document in general, we look at the planning context for it, what determinants are used in evaluating the plan, and we often are looking to our natural and geographic environment for programming, park facilities, and we also look at our demographics and changes in that demographic from each time that we update the plan and into the future. Just an overview of Kenmore's natural environment is there's definitely land availability is limited. We're definitely a built-out community, mostly residential in nature, so access to available open space is not easy to find. We're less than a mile is available on our waterfront for public access. We do have steep slope conditions, which limit ideal conditions for athletic fields, and shoreline, the shoreline environment as you were talking about, and critical areas do encumber available upland, undeveloped land. In terms of who we are as a community, we're in 2018, the Office of Financial Management says that we have an estimated 22,920 residents, and we're expected to increase that over 5,000 residents by 2035. We're an equal match of male to female. Our median age is around 40, which means about 45% of our population is over the age of 35. And the majority of our population is white with an increased almost 12% Asian, and of course other ethnicities are below that ratio. So the document is set out, with overarching goals. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about those in more detail as we move further in the planning process. Staff will be taking a look at what the existing goals and policies and objectives are, and looking how we can streamline them, making sure that we're accounting for any changes that would occur that we did not have in our thought processes in 2013. But the document is set up to have some key values and stewardship, balance, in what we provide our community, and our community's image were these values that were established in 2013. We'll revisit those and make sure we're still agreeable to where they are given our community's needs and make any adjustments to that. But essentially there's a section in the plan that talks about what opportunities and what needs do we have for the park system, a desire for, and these are listed here. Number one, as you probably know, access to the waterfront has been a large goal for the community since 1998, and it continues to be. This idea of having local access to recreation facilities and programs, connecting our parks, looking at the park system as a whole and how can we develop safe routes to our parks, and connecting them from park to park so that people have a way in which they can access our park system without having to use a vehicle per se. And providing diverse park experiences within the park system. So in each park, what is available to our residents for use? Is it simply just a playground in a grass field, or are there other things that we're making available as people's interest in recreation changes over time? And then opportunities. The last pros plan really heavily talked about this waterfront access and developing, park facilities at the waterfront, and also this concept of a water walk trail, which would connect or provide a similar experience as we have in Bothell, where there's this Sammamish River Trail, this idea that we would connect Logboot Park to Squires Landing. Active recreation facilities such as athletics, really activating our downtown by providing park and recreation spaces. And also, how are we honing in on partnerships to provide recreation programs? I'm just going to do a very, high-level overview of the park system. I might not be hitting all of the elements that are in our parks, but this is just to give you a general idea. It's a total of 46 acres, and I want to apologize, it includes 11 city-owned parks and open space facilities. It includes amenities such as a trail, senior center, one public leisure special event facility that's brand new. I think you might know what I'm referring to. It's the hangar building and the town square. One public pier at Logboot Park, 3 new docks between Logboot Park, Rhododendron, and Squires Landing. One beach access point at Logboot Park. So we're trying to increase our access to our city's water. One play field, 1 sports court at Rhododendron Park, and 7 playgrounds throughout the park system. And we this year in 2018, we did a really good job of inventorying our park assets, and we sent out a bunch of interns to, I guess I could say, send with a GPS unit and had them walk the park system, identify different features. And one of the things we were able to gain is understanding what our trails, what between asphalt and non-paved and concrete and boardwalk. How much trails do we have in our system? And we've approximated 7.5 miles. And the big thing that I think that wasn't recognized in 2013 that I think we want to recognize is that although we have 146 acres, 120 of that, over 80%, is within urban forest or critical areas. So as you can see what kind of park system we are a natural park system. In the city, which is also available to our residents, we want to recognize that in the Parks and Recreation Open Space Plan, is that we have a 300 plus acre state park, we have a boat launch, 3 miles of regional trail, that's the Burke-Gilman Trail, 7 acres available at Bastyr for athletics, 1 public fishing dock at the Harbor Village Marina just to the east of Logboot Park, and school playgrounds and playfields. So this is kind of the fun part of the presentation, is kind of really talking about what did we achieve between 2013 and 2019. And I think it's pretty phenomenal the amount of work that's been done in this last 6 years. And I'd like to highlight some of those accomplishments. The Twin Springs, which was known as the King County portal site, was conveyed to the city from King County. So we received that in the early parts of that 6 years. Squires Landing, we also added less than an acre of land, but basically gave us direct access to the Sammamish River, which we did not have before at Squires Landing, and it launched a community effort to provide water activities or community programming around water sports. So that's the Kenmore Waterfront Activity Center, a KWAC as we call it for short. But really that was the impetus of getting people out on the water more. We finished the City Hall skate court. North Shore Summit Park was basically built. Log Boom, we had basically a seasonal float attached to the pier that allows people to access the water in the summer months. We rebuilt, I should say, a bridge that connects the Log Boom Park to the marina to allow people to access the dock, the fishing pier there. And the big thing was that during this time, even though we developed the PROS plan in 2013, there was a big effort to kind of reconnect with the community about what priorities they wanted in 2015 and 16, the Imagine Kenmore outreach process. And that was the real driver to establish our 6-year CIP at that time, and a bond measure that went to the voters in November of 16, the Walkways and Waterways bond measure. And as you can see, 3 of the 5 projects are park projects, Log Boom Park, Rhododendron Park, and Squires Landing. We'll talk about a few of those soon. And in this last part of the 6 years, we really kind of made some significant accomplishments in the park system. We added a boardwalk as part of the Walkways and Waterways projects and a float at Rhododendron Park. We replaced a residential float at Squires Landing, the new portion of Squires Landing that we purchased, the most western 0.7 acres of our park, to provide better public access to the water, allowing people to get directly to Sammamish River. We actually completed a section of the Tolt Pipeline Trail between 68th and 73rd. Again, Town Square and the Hangar Building was constructed and really launched the community's access to the downtown, a gathering space, and really a special events facility that we've been able to provide good community events. And Morelands Park was renovated, including improving the athletic field there, redoing the playground. It's been a very successful neighborhood park improvement project. And lastly, which is not on the slide, but I'll mention, is that Twin Springs, the portal site that we received early in that 6 years, we finished a master plan last year, and we're starting to look at how we can develop, I guess I'd say, first step improvements to the site to open it for public use. Interesting. Sorry, my font changed there. Now I guess I wanted to kind of talk about what are some projects that are in the works in this in our current 6-year CIP. Every year we update the CIP, and as you can imagine, we look to our capital facilities plan for updating that 6-year project list, so that we're always going back to what we said in the PROS plan we were going to try to accomplish, and look at that list and see how we can implement the list within the current 6-year funded projects. The Walkways and Waterways projects are yet to be completed. They're in process. Log Boom Park, waterfront, and Squires Landing improvements. I'm going to show you those in a few minutes just to give you an idea of them. In conjunction with the Squires Landing project, we're going to be needing to purchase additional land along the Swamp Creek corridor. We'll be building a boathouse to house the rowing crew program, the Kenmore Rowing Club, and the Inglemore High School rowing program. We're going to be opening, hopefully, improving the conditions and opening Twin Springs Park, which is in the process, and working on the SEPA and EIS for the St. Ed's Ballfield project. And the other thing that we're doing as a result of work that we just talked about at Rhododendron Park and Squires Landing, as we are developing projects within the shoreline jurisdiction and near and around critical areas, we are obviously having to do mitigation for those unavoidable impacts to provide public access. And so essentially what we need to do is we need to make sure that we're monitoring and maintaining the mitigation that's required of those types of projects. And right now we're in the process of doing that for the Rhododendron Boardwalk and Float and Squires Landing Float project. As well, I should mention that at Squires Landing, 2 acres along the Sammamish River and Swamp Creek were improved by an organization called Adopt a Stream Foundation, and in conjunction with the Snohomish King Watershed Council. The city in 2015 agreed to maintain their project after they complete it. They finished it at the end of 2018, and we're now in the process of beginning to monitor and maintain that. And that is required to be maintained and monitored for over 10 years. So again, this is Log Boom Park. This is the 30% site plan that was submitted for environmental, land use permits. That's the stage that we're at right now. It provides new pedestrian pathway improvements, ADA access to the water, including, providing direct access to the shoreline in 2 places. It provides a facility for housing our concessionaire who came to the city in this past 6 years, and that we agreed we would like to provide rental water-dependent watercraft, so hand-powered kayak, stand-up, and paddleboard. So that building that you see there in the middle of the site plan is really kind of a concessionaire's building. It does what I think the community is asking for in terms of providing some additional access to the water by expanding the existing beach area, which is right about here right now, and expanding it towards the west. That's mainly the project, and again, we're going to be doing enhancements based on the need to, because the entire site is within the shoreline and the buffer of the shoreline and the wetlands on site, and so we'll be providing additional mitigation on this site as well. Squires Landing, again, is a larger project. It essentially is providing for the first time for about 7.5 acres public access to the waterfront in the form of providing facilities, recreation and park facilities, parking, restroom, pathways and boardwalk, and access to this man-made lagoon that provides access for watercraft, hand-powered watercraft. It does include some bridges to allow the community to have access directly on the Sammamish River for wildlife viewing and other viewing and natural viewing opportunities, as well as partaking in any of the recreation activities that were going to be scheduled there by the Kenmore Waterfront Activity Center. There's a bit of work that we'll be doing on this small, like I mentioned, the 0.7 acre parcel. That's what I was referring to that the city purchased in this last 6 years, including providing a picnic shelter, again, getting access to the larger part of Squires Landing. And as you may or may not know, this site is a total of 40 plus acres, and we're really only developing about 7.5 acres of that 40 acres. So it extends further east than this site plan shows. This is a little sneak peek of the boat house building that is going to be built really close to the boat ramp. It's on the city's portion of that area. And the idea here is where we built the actual float. It's to allow, it was designed for the rowing club and for Inglemoor High School's rowing program. And because it was designed for that, we need a place to be able to house these 8-person crew boats that are temporarily being held at Log Boom Park, and that's how they're operating right now. But this project will essentially build them a new home. So we accomplished a lot and are in the process of accomplishing a significant amount of work. But the capital facilities plan, the one that we currently have in place right now, was set in place in 2015 based on recommendation from the PROS plan. It was updated in 2018, but I don't think the update didn't affect the list of park improvement projects. So I'm just giving you a little example of what some of the other unfunded capital improvement projects are. Again, more access to the waterfront in the forms of purchasing land, preserving open space along Swan Creek. Can we acquire more land to do that? Expanding outdoor recreation, athletic facilities. Can we be looking for land acquisition opportunities for that? Expanding the size of existing parks, again, buying land to be able to increase our park system that way by expanding the boundaries of existing facilities. You know, for our linear park system, you know, we've just begun on the Tolt Pipeline Trail, and this plan would be looking to continue that potentially eastward is the most easiest way to continue that from 73rd through to like 80th. Connecting parks and open spaces, I mentioned that it's an overarching opportunity, and it is listed as a capital project. And providing indoor recreation facility, a place where people can go to recreate indoors, and that's more of a regional partnership opportunity. It's on our list, and it will require a significant amount of coordination with other cities for the city to be able to accomplish that project. And then lastly, what kind of development or expansion opportunities do we have? How can we improve our existing parks, add new parks, develop new parks, and or renovate existing parks? And some of the things that haven't been completed yet are Wallace Swamp Creek Park. We haven't made any major improvements. We've done a master plan there, but we haven't improved it. Twin Springs, again, we're on the tip of what can be possible at that site. Just trying to get it open is the first goal, providing essential facilities for opening it, but what else is possible? How can we take that master plan and fully implement it? City Hall Park, we've only implemented a portion of that project. There's plans for a sports court and potentially a pickleball court that hasn't been developed as part of that project. And rhododendrons in the same place. We have a master plan that we've implemented a portion of that master plan, and there's still more work that can be done there. Again, I mentioned the Tolt Pipeline Trail, Linwood Park. It's in the very northwest part of the city. Hasn't received any major improvements, and that's one I think that is on the list for renovating and expanding, sort of how we did with Morelands Park for providing better neighborhood park amenities there. And then again, the Regional Community Center and outdoor recreation facility. So this is where we are today. We have more work to do. Staff is already starting the process and working towards getting you more information that you can kind of bite your teeth into, so to speak. Right now, this is a very high-level introduction. But the first step is that on May 13th, it sounds like you have a quorum to attend that meeting. We'd like to take advantage of that and present you results of the community survey that we did in January. I don't know if any of you received the survey, but essentially it's going to give you a review of the results of the survey, and we'll be having our consultant attend that meeting and present to City Council, and you'll have an opportunity to be listening and participating in that discussion. And then in June at your regular meeting, June 18th, we'd like to dive more into the specific goals, objectives, and policies that, again, are the overarching policy that drives the decisions for meeting need and for providing our capital project facility plan. And then in July, we're getting, again, the staff report mentioned that HBB Landscape Architects are assisting the city with preparing a demand and need analysis and a level of service analysis. And they're taking information from the survey and kind of the work that staff is doing right now on updating the capital facilities plan based on survey results and getting that in draft form. And then they'll be helping us prepare an analysis of demand and needs so that we can determine what that is and whether we have the right capital facility plan projects list. We would like to share that with the community and make sure we are in alignment with how they feel. So in the summer, I'm going to try to take advantage of some of our community events and attend some of those for engaging with the public on the information we have to that point. And then we'd like to have a community outreach meeting at one of your normal scheduled meeting dates in August, where you get the opportunity to also participate with the community in reviewing what we have prepared so far. And then comes the work of putting it all together. Again, Debbie mentioned, or maybe you've read already, that we're trying to do this in the format of the comprehensive plan, and instead of it referring to it as a separate plan, we're trying to actually develop it as an element. So it's going to try to follow the same formatting as other elements for the comprehensive plan. And then after we do that, and you review it as a draft, we submit it for SEPA and notification with commerce and present it to council. Then after the adoption process through the normal comprehensive plan amendments process, then we're going to take it and finesse it if we need to, not change anything, but format it in the way that Recreation and Conservation Office would like it to be received as a standalone document versus part of the comprehensive plan. That's the overview I have for you.
So I have a question. I'm really interested in understanding the costs for maintenance and development in comparing that to the use of the parks. And so I'm not sure where we might see that kind of information. How much we're paying on the current, to maintain current parks, what level of maintenance. I don't know if there are different sort of levels depending on the type of park it is and so forth. So all of those factors related to keeping our parks in good shape for folks, as well as how frequently they're visited.
Well, that is good comments. The community survey will help us understand how frequently people are using parks, and so that will come to you in May. And then in July, HBB is trying to put together a discussion around level of service and the ideas of, the cost it is to maintain our park system, and the level of maintenance will be reviewed in that process and part of the discussion. But I just wanted to let you know that in general, maintenance of the existing park system is slightly a different animal, and that it falls under our regular budget process versus the PROS plan is more about, how are we going to improve and maintain our park system now and into the future.
But usually when we're developing a capital project, a park improvement project, you have the capital costs of what you do to design and permit and build it, but you also have kind of a separate spreadsheet over here which says once it's built, then what will it need to maintain sort of ongoing operations, and then thinking ahead even further in the future to how long do these facilities last and when would you have to replace them. But essentially the focus for this discussion is largely on the improvement side rather than on the maintenance budget side. That's sort of the distinction. But we'll bring forward as much information as we can.
Right, that kind of information, I think that's a really good point, Suzanne. Will, I guess, inform whatever kind of list of priorities that we do. Obviously, the city council is in charge of all the capital improvements and budgeting and so forth. So I think this would really help us help make some decisions on what we think are our priority projects.
I think largely that the Planning Commission's involvement on the capital facilities side is mostly on that unconstrained large project list. So when you're looking at it, you're looking at more of the aspirational of what we would like to see within the 20 years. And then when the council then is the one that develops the 6-year capital improvement program, which is approved as part of the budget process, they then take that aspirational 20-year plan and say what can we actually fund within that 6 years, either through grant funding or other city funds. But the Planning Commission's focus is again more in the comprehensive plan capital facilities element, which is on the unconstrained 20-year list.
Okay, thank you.
So I know that you did a survey and you got some information back, but as a project, do you actually do any kind of surveys to see how the parks are used, weekday versus weekends? I mean, how do you?
We haven't done any of those actual counts.
Like counts, yeah.
So we've largely been relying on surveys or sort of generally what we have observed, but we haven't done any official counts.
It'd be nice to know, because it would help us to understand where to put the priorities. I mean, I've always loved Linwood Park, which is tucked away. Most people don't even know where it is. but it has a lot of potential to serve the public.
Right.
But, just knowing that it's not used very much.
You can kind of back yourself into that kind of information by looking at whether it's actual users, or you can then look at the data you collect in terms of what is typically you would need to have in your park system to serve the community needs. So that's kind of how you would back into it, rather than going to see how is it currently used. You would
Okay.
look at data to sort of support what you think you will need in the future to support where
Right.
the community growth and where that growth will occur. So
Yeah.
that's really how we typically back into it.
And the other caveat is that we're kind of a regional drawing card because we are trying to develop this access to the lake. So though we have residents we want to serve, actually we're serving a broader,
Right.
picture. So I don't know how you collect data on that, but
Well, to speak a little bit of that, and I didn't go into it, and I apologize, but we're also going to be reviewing park, in our pros plan, there's classifications for parks.
okay.
And we're going to be revisiting what was developed in 2013 and looking at making a change to that. And regional parks are one of those park types that serve more of a regional draw. And for instance, Log Boom Park is an example of that. And we believe that Squires Landing is going to be another potential
Yeah.
for its expansive open space and natural critical areas, as well as this new access point we're developing to the water. So we're going to be kind of going through a review of those park classifications. The other category is community park. An example of that would be Rhododendron Park, where we have a lot of community events, community facilities there. And then lastly, as you mentioned, like Linwood Park and Morelands Park are examples of neighborhood level parks where the draw is much closer, it's much more intimately based on, walkability, and facilities that are provided there are more, neighborhood in nature. So we're going to be reviewing that, and I think that'll speak to, that is then used to analyze what is needed in our park system is based on what classifications it's set at. Then you develop, in these types of park classifications, these are the facilities that are usually, we define it, and then we say, do we have those facilities, and what condition are they in? Are they needing to be updated or renovated, as an example? Linwood Park is an example of that.
Yeah.
And so we'll be going through that as part of the update process.
Okay. Appreciate that.
Mr. Vanderline.
I was really struck at one of the numbers in your earlier part of your presentation, where we're looking at a projection of a 25% increase in our population from our baseline to the future. That's a pretty striking number for a very small city. And also thinking about the ongoing silver tsunami that within the next 6 years, it's coming, folks. So I'm wondering, just how do we look at the demographic impacts, and what do we know about the demographic impact and how that would impact particularly the park situation, but also some of the program part of that, which the last time we went through that in 2013, we didn't really look at programs as much as we did space and parks. And I'm wondering what demographic impacts, or the impact of the demographic change might have on some of those choices in the future.
That's kind of part of the data that we're collecting, and that will be part of the needs analysis and level of service information that we'll be bringing forward to you that sort of ties those two things together. Where is the population growing? What are the demographics looking like? And then you marry that with the results of the community survey, and you get a pretty good idea of are we deficient in any areas, and how we're going to meet that deficiency.
And in May, at the joint discussion that you're having with council, when people fill out their survey, they filled out demographic information. And so you're going to get to see a little bit of the results of that and how people are using parks and who is using our parks and how are they using it.
And that was a statistically valid survey. That wasn't kind of a self-survey. It was a statistically valid survey, so those results are pretty valid.
Along the same lines, I'd be real interested if you have any information on how different types of development impacts what citizens are looking for, a population might be looking for in terms of recreation. We spent a lot of time building up density in multifamily housing. Do people living in a 1, 2, 3 bedroom multifamily environment, look for different things in terms of recreation than our predominantly single-family neighborhoods we have today. Don't know the answer to that, that's a
No,
question.
I don't know the answer to that either. It's a
But
an
I think
intriguing
that-
question.
But that's one of the other huge impacts we are going to be seeing. Actually, we're encouraging it, we're causing it to happen. So what does that mean in terms of the type of recreational facilities that people would expect to see?
Well, we'll definitely take a look at that as our needs analysis, see if we can talk to our consultant about finding some data on that.
So I'm also curious about our regional partnerships and how we're going to engage those folks. And I know with transit coming in and other things, the distance between cities decreases because we'll see more people from Bothell and so forth here. So I'm interested to understand how we're accounting for that influx of our neighbors, as well as how we're partnering with those cities on these kinds of initiatives.
Well, I think some of it might shake out if you look at things which you might be looking at needing more than one city to provide. And I'll throw out an idea that a swimming pool is an example of that. Not every city is going to provide a swimming pool, but there might be more of a regional need for an aquatic centre. Those kind of facilities are where you might be looking at those regional partnerships. But if you're looking at more a local park that people can walk to, that's again more local focus. So again, when we're looking at the data that we get, I think that's what we're going to try and tease out. What are some of those facilities which might result in the need for a regional partnership? An athletic field or an aquatic facility or a larger community facility. Those are the kind of things which often fall into that.
It's following on the idea of interdisciplinary or interjurisdictional types of projects we might do, like a swimming pool is a good one. What sort of financing options might be different with that sort of approach versus city as a whole, city exclusively?
Well,
I don't expect an answer to that right now, but
well, I think.
Can say the sky's the limit.
Well, I mean, not necessarily. I mean, I think, if you were looking at something like that, you would have to kind of figure out what would make sense as sort of the logical boundaries for that. Is it the school district boundaries, for example? That's an area that encompasses multiple cities. So you kind of figure out where your boundaries are. Then you figure out, is it playing with individual cities, or do you have to set up another kind of level of government, like your municipal park district? So again, a lot of it depends on the kind of facility and then the options available. But typically, if you're trying to fund things across boundaries of different cities, it makes sense to have sort of a larger entity to support that, like a park district.
exactly, that's what I was thinking. If you have a regional park district, what does that do to your potential financing options? I think like bonding. You have a state park here.
It could add options. Whether that's the way to go, I don't know. Again, we're kind of at the very start of this project, so we'll have to see if it makes sense. And if it does make sense, then you sort of say it may make sense if you were doing this kind of facility.
So tagging on to that, just so you know, we might ask you, is there anything like that out there in the state or through our neighborhood regions, just to draw on? So maybe doing some research on that would be good.
Sure.
Just so we're ready.
Yep.
Because that question will
that.
come up again.
And the other thing, to kind of play off of what Debbie was saying with regards to, park districts, oftentimes parks districts or enterprise zones are developed, but they're very specific to a need. You probably saw the example of Seattle developing, their whole system as a park district. But that's unlikely to happen at a city our size, or, we're not necessarily going to be looking at this PROS plan through the lens of all of our regional cities. It's where we need to provide the local, meeting the local need is what we're trying to focus on for mostly, I would say, the park assets. But where, like we're talking about a larger facility that might have a regional need, then we would be talking more about a park district for that specific thing.
That's a really good scope issue that we need to tease out early. But I'm also thinking about, there's a theme that's kind of starting to run through these, which is, we're a city of 22,000. We got to find a way to leverage the financing of this beyond the 22,000 base if we're actually going to achieve that any part of that unrestrained list. We're probably already approaching some sort of an upper limit about what the city by itself can really finance, particularly when you start thinking about how do you maintain what you've really got. And I think about the future, maybe the best way to do that is to figure out how do we partner, how do we leverage other folks' needs. If we're going to become a transportation center, as we're trying to be, we're going to have access, community access, that may be part of the solution. We can spend a lot of time coming up with an unconstrained list, but if we don't have a realistic way to finance that, it's really not a very fruitful or productive effort.
And
I
we're
think
not really
part
in-
of it, you would be looking at the options for financing, so you would at least be creating a list of what those potential options would be, what those potential funding sources would be, and how they might apply to the different kinds of projects, because some funding sources may lend themselves to a particular kind of project and other funding sources might not.
Yeah.
It really takes us back to the scope question.
Yeah.
If we don't know that there's some options out here, then there's no sense talking about something this big. But if there is, but it's specific, then that, I think, pushes in a different direction that might be more productive than.
And again, it's going to be helpful to us to look at other types of cities our size.
Yep.
They might not have the same physical assets we do, but we could at least look at what they have done, so we
Yes.
can see a pattern.
We could definitely do that. Going back to your question about, we can't afford everything that's on, almost no park district who develops a pros plan can meet the unconstrained list. It's not the point. The point is to develop aspirational, like Debbie mentioned, aspirational goals, projects that we think are going to, in the long haul, meet the needs of our community. Then, like you mentioned, and Debbie has mentioned, then it's really about then prioritizing that in a sequence. Like short term is the 6-year list. You have a midterm and a long term, and a lot of the larger projects that are more regional in nature may not be able to fall into that first 6 years unless there's a real driving factor for that. If there's already cooperation by multiple agencies to achieve that goal. Otherwise, it will have to stay within our list. But if we don't have it on the list, just to get to the point of you saying, well, why are we doing it? You do it so that if the opportunity presents itself in the future, we're poised to say, and we can qualify for state and federal grants that says we have a project that has been on our list, and now there is the drive to make this happen. We're going to bring this forward, and now we're going to apply for grant funding to make it happen. But if it's not on that list, then we can't do that. We would have to wait to update the plan in order to get it in. So again, it puts us in a better position financially to provide that larger aspirational list, even if some of them may not be a near-term project that we can achieve.
I'm thinking about the Sound to the Mountains Greenway. I mean, when that was first talked about, 35 years ago, everybody thought, well, that's crazy. But when you look at the collaborative work across city jurisdictions and in the county, it does take that aspirational kind of dreaming, what could we do here, kind of thinking at this point for this long-term list.
And just so you know, Kenmore is in the Greenway.
It is, so that helps us.
It also helps us with partnering opportunities to maintain our natural resources within our parks that I think we haven't really tapped into yet in this city.
Good point. Wasn't thinking that way, but great minds start to collaborate.
So I have a question about the community outreach meeting. How will you be advertising that, and will it include our neighboring cities, or is it just focused on Kenmore?
You mean the May 13th?
The August 6th.
Oh, the August 6th. Well, we'll be doing outreach in as many ways that make sense. If we have a newsletter that goes out to every household, that means all Kenmore is notified. We have the city website, social media. We have other ways of kind of publishing that wider. And we would probably just let our neighboring cities know, particularly the folks who are, the parks project managers in the other cities, because, like us, we like to know what our neighbors are doing, and they're probably interested in what we're doing. So, yeah, we would definitely have that broad outreach.
And if it makes sense, we would do an individual house mailer to all residents, but it just depends on the timing of where we fall. If we can get into the newsletter, it certainly saves us funding to do it that way. And just to speak on neighboring cities, Bothell is also beginning their pros plan process as well, and staff have been talking to their staff, and I'm sure we'll try to collaborate as much as possible on any opportunities for partnerships. But they will have potentially different needs than our city has, so we'll try to be aware and to align so that we're thinking about our neighboring cities collaboratively. But again, they may have different drivers for meeting their need for parks, and it really does depend on what their community need is and what their level of service is and how they're developing their plan.
Yeah, I just had one other thing. I think we'll get a lot of good data from the community survey. One other data point I guess I was personally curious in as we're looking especially at active recreation is participation in youth sports, like figures from, I know it's not necessarily always Kenmore specific, but youth baseball and soccer and basketball and crew and all the other, just to get kind of an idea of what the sort of younger generation is engaged in now. I think the skate park is, I don't know if you have data on how many kids use it. It seems to be kids, the younger people, which is, in my case, almost everybody, with my helmet, my pads, no. But I'm trying to get maybe a little bit, as again, I was talking about sort of active recreation facilities, and maybe this will be in the, sort of demand and need component there, but would be really curious to get some numbers and also trends about, what sports are becoming more popular, what are maybe less popular, especially among the under 18 crew. So.
Well, and that's definitely in line with what we're going to be presenting you for the demand and need analysis.
Okay. Yeah.
The other thing is that we're going to rely pretty heavily on the results of the survey, and you're going to see that we've talked about what do people want for recreation facilities and what do they want for recreation programming, and we're going to be really highlighting that and using that as the initial driver for how to develop the needs analysis, because we specifically asked those questions of all of these facilities. What is your need? What's the need of your household? And essentially, that breaks down into statistics that we're going to use to justify how do we prioritize the needs for the community moving forward.
And David, your point about being statistically valid, so we're going to get a statistically valid sampling of, as like Mike was kind of alluding to single family, multifamily, different age demographics, et cetera.
Yep.
So,
Yeah,
okay, good.
Yeah,
Good.
and you're jumping right into it, and
Great,
this is
we're all
this is
ready, I
great
think.
though. In a month, when you hear the consultant present the results of the community survey, a lot is going to become clear to you about what the community needs are, because that survey really makes it clear, and we have some good graphics in terms of charts and bar graphs, and that are going to help that talk about our demographics and talk about what the community's need are for physical assets and for recreation programming. So that's what we really have to use to kickstart the analysis. We do kind of the man on the street questioning we can do, but it's not statistically valid. So this is how we know our analysis is valid, and it sets the stage for that.
Thank you.
And we've also had past surveys, so through the Imagine Kenmore process in 2015, we had surveys in 2013. So, that's another way to kind of see, is there any trends? Is there something new that's popped up? Are people more satisfied, or what's changed? So we have a sort of a history of data collection too.
Great, that'll be very helpful. Yeah.
And, the topic of benchmarking and how do we fit in with other cities, some of which might be, of our size, but might be national. consultant team that we've hired, that's kind of what they specialize in. They specialize in looking at benchmarking across the United States because they do these surveys with other cities of similar sizes. And they're going to help us identify where we sit amongst other cities. That gives you a little bit of kind of awareness of, and quite truthfully, I think that you'll see soon when you get that packet information, we're doing pretty good here in Kenmore given the size of our city.
At it a little bit backwards because it's not like we incorporated in 1940 and had this ongoing vision. It was kind of the other way around. We incorporated under duress so that we could create a city. But this is the hard work of what we had hoped to accomplish. And it really is quite remarkable that in 6 years, all of those different things have taken place. So we know that, there's the next chapter. So this will be fun.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, great comments. Any other questions or thoughts? Plenty of other opportunities, obviously, to engage on this as we dig deeper into it. So anything else for us?
Well, I think the other thing just to mention is last night at the council meeting, the council approved an ordinance putting the mobile home park regulations in place across all 6 parks. They then passed a resolution which basically says we want to do something different for the 4 parks north of SR 522 and sending that back to the Planning Commission to consider. And if you remember, that was one of the Planning Commission recommendations, was to, after a defined period, and that period is 10 years, it would allow those 4 parks to increase their density for redevelopment with an affordable component. So that project will be coming back to you, and the intent then is to finish that this year to give your recommendations to the council. As it will involve comprehensive plan amendments, then the adoption will be towards the end of the year, but we want to bring that back to you in May. So that's something that you will see as well. So we'll be juggling that project along with update to the pros plan as your next kind of work plan effort.
Great. Okay. Thanks for the update, Debbie. Anything else I think the agenda is completed. Anything else anybody wants to bring up? Thank you. We're adjourned.
Thank you.